I am in Lincoln City, Indiana at Lincoln State Park. This is a state park right across from the boyhood home of Abraham Lincoln, which is right across the street. I have videos on that. Well, I've been there many times. I've never actually stopped in here, and this place does have actual connections to Abraham Lincoln, so I figured we go check it out. My first stop in the park is going to be the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Plaza, which was dedicated in 2009 during the 200th anniversary of Lincoln's birth. Of course, he was born in Kentucky, not here. This memorial looks really interesting, and of course is composed of Indiana limestone. The Plaza Memorial has multiple layers to it, with a height timeline and much information about different aspects of Abraham Lincoln. This slab tells about his experience growing up in the wilderness here, and has a quote about how he was so abnormally large and tall that he had an axe put into his hands at once. One sure did learn the value of work surviving out here. This one is about his education, of which very little came out of a school. He was largely self-taught by reading every book he could get his hands on. Lincoln had two mother figures throughout his boyhood here. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was a kind and intelligent woman, an angel as Abraham would remember, but she died when Lincoln was just 9 years old. His father married Sarah Bush Johnson soon after, and Abe's stepmom was a strong supporter of Lincoln throughout the rest of his life. On this slab is a quote about Lincoln by his childhood friend here in Indiana, Nathaniel Grigsby, that his mind and the ambition of the man soared above us. He was very much respected by the local boys and assumed much trust for his leadership abilities that were nurtured here in these very woods. Lincoln had a quick wit and was a fantastic storyteller. He attained many of his stories while growing up around here listening to the stories and words of adults. He would memorize entire sermons from church and repeat them to friends. Of course, Lincoln dealt with great loss and hardship. As mentioned, his mother died when he was 9, and his sister died here as well. We'll visit her grave in this state park a little later. But all this sorrow would help him deal with the unimaginable during the Civil War. In 1828, Lincoln got work on a flatboat and floated down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers to New Orleans. On these journeys, he got a sense of how people lived and acted outside of these woods, and first truly witnessed slavery. I really like this quote he said in New Salem, Illinois, that I have no other ambition so great as that of being truly esteemed by my fellow men, by rendering myself worthy of their esteem. And that he certainly did throughout his life, and clearly those skills and behaviors were learned and experienced here. There are also these directional markers, this one pointing a bit southeast toward Hodgenville, Kentucky, where Lincoln was born and grew up until the age of 7, when in 1816 the Lincolns moved out here. To the west is Macon County, Illinois, where the Lincolns moved to in 1830 when Lincoln was 21. I have been to Thomas Lincoln's farm there that Abraham helped set up, but Abraham quickly went off on his own at that point. And to the east lies Washington, D.C., where Lincoln truly made history. This wall gives a timeline of America's tallest president's physical height growth while here in Indiana. There's also an interesting Wordsworth quote, "The child is father of the man." And with this limestone you can see how Lincoln, who would be considered very tall even today, grew to be a giant in his own. In 1830 he was about an inch or two taller than me, and we were about the same age. I thought he'd be taller. To be fair, he still had several inches on me, and there is more on the backside of the plaza. On the backside of the memorial is this bronze sculpture of Abraham Lincoln from the torso up. That is a very cool statue. Lincoln's hands on the statue are humongous. The closed left hand symbolizes his desire to hold the Union together, and the open right hand symbolizes his desire for a strong positive post-war reconciliation with the South, which didn't go as well as he would have hoped. Flanking the statue is the Gettysburg Address and his second inaugural address. Just 5 weeks after the second inaugural, General Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia, effectively concluding the Civil War after everything Lincoln had pushed through. And just 5 days after that, he was assassinated. The statue is inscribed that the young man who grew up in southern Indiana with no special advantages became one of our nation's greatest presidents. His life and words continue to speak to all Americans and indeed to all people throughout the entire world as we strive to work for peace, fairness, and justice. This is an extremely impressive and complex memorial, definitely one of the best Lincoln tributes I've ever seen. And this memorial really proves that his growing up here in Indiana was vital to everything he accomplished. This is the Little Pigeon Creek, the creek around which Abraham Lincoln learned and grew up. Now stopped off at the Little Pigeon Primitive Baptist Church and Cemetery here within the state park. This is the current active church structure, the third on the site. This plaque commemorates the bicentennial of the church. It's been in service for over 200 years now. Thomas and Abraham Lincoln did help to build the original Little Pigeon Creek Baptist Church at this site, which was a little log structure. This cemetery is the final resting place for many of the early Little Pigeon Creek area settlers. This is the grave of Sarah Lincoln Grigsby, the older sister of Abraham Lincoln. She was born to Thomas and Nancy Hanks Lincoln in 1807 in Elizabethtown, Kentucky, so not the same place as Abraham, but she and Abraham grew up together and always had each other, even after their mother died and when their father could be a real jerk. Next to her big grave is the grave of her husband Aaron Grigsby, whom she married in August of 1826, likely here at the Little Pigeon Creek Church. Sadly, Sarah passed away while giving birth to a stillborn baby on January 20th, 1828. Abraham Lincoln was extremely fond of his older sister, as she was the only surviving sibling from their biological mother. Sarah had comforted and cared for little Lincoln after their mother died, so her death was a real tough pill to swallow. Apparently when she died, her husband went to the Lincoln homestead and told Abraham that she had died while he was standing in the smokehouse doorway. According to one account, he just sat down and buried his face in his hands, and tears slowly trickled between his bony fingers, and his gaunt frame shook with sobs. Abraham did blame the death of his sister on Aaron Grigsby for not getting a doctor to help. Here on Sarah's tombstone, pennies adorned with the face of her brother are placed in and around the floral carving. There's also lots of pennies on top of the tombstone. And I will leave my own Lincoln penny in tribute to Abraham Lincoln's loving sister, who died very young. At this point, I have been to the graves of most of the Lincolns, including their mother Nancy Hanks Lincoln, who is buried at the Pioneer Cemetery and Lincoln Boyhood National Memorial nearby. For whatever reason, she was not buried here at the church, but closer to their homestead. Now we'll explore the rest of this little cemetery. American flags usually indicate a veteran is buried here. There are possibly some Revolutionary War veterans here. Like most old pioneer cemeteries, many of the graves are unmarked. There are some broken gravestones. They do deteriorate over time. This is the grave of Dr. Frederick McCassin, who was originally from New Jersey, then moved to Ohio. Then his tombstone says that they traveled by oxen and covered wagon to build a home on the new western frontier of Indiana. Abraham Lincoln was for a time the church's sexton, which meant he got to upkeep the church structure and grounds. He rang the bell for services and dug the graves here. This is the grave of James Gentry Jr., the son of James Gentry Sr., who owned a store and knew the Lincolns. We'll see his home site soon. There are also some more recent graves in the cemetery. This one is from 1998. So this is a really interesting cemetery where the Lincolns went to church and where the sister of the president is laid to rest. This park is perhaps most well known for the Lincoln Amphitheater, an outdoor concert venue that was built in 1987. I don't think they're having too many performances right now due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but they do have some images of Abraham Lincoln inside here. Appropriate. I've stumbled across a roadside unit of the state park, the home site of James Gentry, which you have to take a little trail to get to. Gentry was a farmer and merchant who was a relatively close neighbor of the Lincolns. I think this is much closer to the Lincoln homestead than the Little Pigeon Creek Church was. He arrived here in 1818, so a couple years after the Lincolns, and purchased 1,000 acres here. At the site of this stone marker, he built a fancy 2-story log cabin with a breezeway and also built a store nearby. Gentry was the man who first employed Abraham Lincoln on a flatboat to help transport merchandise to New Orleans in 1828. Then in the spring of 1830, the Lincolns left their log cabin and spent their last night in this area at the Gentry home before departing for Illinois. It could be said that Lincoln's Indiana boyhood concluded right here. This is a really cool and little known historic site. I had no idea about this. I'm now going to drive to the nearby town of Gentryville, Indiana, likely named after James Gentry, to see another Lincoln-related historic site. I'm now at the Colonel William Jones State Historic Site, a unit of Lincoln State Park. This was the fanciful home of Colonel William Jones, who first came to this part of Indiana in 1827. He originally lived in a log cabin nearby like everyone else. He was a farmer, but he also opened and operated a successful store nearby. And that's how he got the money to build this very nice Federal-style brick home in 1834. He was involved in transporting merchandise on flatboats to New Orleans. He also employed Abraham Lincoln at his store to butcher and process meat and to unpack boxes. Lincoln also borrowed all of Jones's books, which of course would end up being critical to Lincoln's abilities later on, and Jones himself once said that Lincoln would make a great man one of these days. But in time, Lincoln went on to Illinois, and Jones stayed here and became a state representative. Their paths came together down the road as they were both Whigs and supporters of Henry Clay. Lincoln wound up doing a lot of campaigning for Clay, and during his journeys Lincoln came to William Jones's home and stayed the night here in 1844. 16 years later, Abraham Lincoln was elected president as the Union was falling apart. So Jones, who was a pretty old man by then, joined the Union Army and became a colonel. Sadly, he was killed at the age of 61 during the Battle of Atlanta on July 22, 1864, after being wounded in the head and thighs. The inside of this home is occasionally open, like 2 days a week on season, and I would very much like to go in, but it's not open right now because it's winter and coronavirus. Looks like this old monument was on the site of the Jones store, where Lincoln often visited and worked. There's an actual stone from it at the National Memorial, but I'm not sure if the store's actual location is currently marked. Regardless, this is a very interesting and old marker. There's also an old barn which is definitely collapsing a bit. So that was Lincoln State Park. I definitely recommend exploring these sites while visiting the National Memorial. This is very overlooked. Please like, share, and subscribe. Also take a look at my other videos on Lincoln history, national and state parks, and much more. Thanks for watching!